You are now going to hear an introduction to this webinar series. This is our SHAW, Soil Health Assessment Workgroup schedule for early 2022. And we are proposing, we have this relatively modest, it is a relatively modest DSP project, Dynamic Soils Properties project. And we are going to devote 3 webinars to trying to unpack the lessons learned from it. And the question down here, does this little project really merit 3 webinars? So I'm going to try to answer that and make you feel like you've got a reason to be here for three webinars. As I said before, this is really the most significant soil health assessment effort ever undertaken by Virginia NRCS. Now, depending on how you categorize different soil health assessment efforts, like running Russell II and getting soil conditioning index values, maybe someone could argue about that. But in terms of collecting soil and measuring soil dynamic properties, getting soils to soil health testing labs like Cornell, we've never done anything like this because we've been waiting to try to do it right. We haven't jumped into it before. So it is significant. Here are some examples of the amount of resources that went into it and the amount of effort. I mean, we did more, or we as a team, I didn't do very much in terms of the assessing, but more than 30 assessments in the field and lab, direct and indirect, many direct assessments of soil, of extracts of the soil from the soil. Also, some indirect assessments of vegetation like PCS. So physical, chemical, and biological. Of course, you're seeing a physical assessment right here in this picture, right? Amusometers, measuring saturated hydrologic conductivity. Or they may actually, I'm not sure if they're in action at the moment, but because that's not my specialty, but that's what those machines, those devices are. We sent soil to multiple labs in multiple states. So as I understand it, multiple Virginia Tech labs got to look at least some aspect, some extract or the soil itself. Dr. Franzluber's lab at NC State, of course, Dr. Franzluber's is a USDA researcher with ARS and also has an North Carolina appointment. And also soils went to the Cornell Soil Health Lab in New York. So, wow, that's impressive, right? A lot going on. And then in terms of, physical resources, I mean, we used a lot of gear, even borrowed some stuff from Dr. Stewart at Virginia Tech, some tools that we bent up, right? So another kind of cool thing is we said, well, to stabilize these samples for biological testing, summertime, hot, can we keep them cold? Well, how do we do that? So we found out that our colleagues with NRCS, the Soils Division down in North Carolina, have a refrigerated trailer, which has fondly became known as the giant Yeti cooler on wheels. And so that was one of my contributions, was to go down and get that. And Carl Peacock helped with that too. So a lot of physical resources and a lot of cash resources. Just the out-of-pocket lab costs at Cornell were over $3,000. But if you sum up the actual cost, if we try to quantify the dollar cost for the work in the other labs, was far greater. And all of that cost was absorbed by our awesome partners. And it goes back to, we've been trying to build partnership around soil health and now soil health assessment for a long time. And so, we owe a lot to our partners because we did not have to ask it would have been difficult to get cash to pay for this. So that was extremely helpful. And finally, probably the most impressive thing is the human resources that went into this project. So this is an opportunity to recognize some people by name and also show a few pictures of them. But look at the number of people who have contributed in some way. And if their name shows up here, the contribution is pretty significant. My name should be one of the smallest, if you will, because I helped from a distance. I didn't get my hands dirty. And I think one of the themes you're going to see is that maybe I should have been more engaged. But the farmer cooperators, of course, help provide the sites. But I'm not going to go through every name here. I'll emphasize that Lydia started working on this project as a Virginia NRCS field office employee. And she currently has transitioned. She's also under Virginia Tech now because she is formerly a Virginia Tech employee. But her engagement through this has been crucial. And you're going to find out, of course, that Alexander Schmidt is really the heart of this effort. And there are probably even others. So there were lots of lessons learned, right? And some of the lessons learned, we learned the hard way. So it's said that, and I believe it, that lessons learned from your failures tend to stick better and are more valuable in some ways than lessons learned from your successes. And so you're going to hear that emphasized today. We're going to spend more time on some of the lessons we learned the hard way, some of our own advice, our own recommendations, and recommendations you've already heard from me about soil health assessment. Today, we didn't actually follow them, that advice. And so that's a very important theme, is that we learn some lessons the hard way. So overall, we think there's enough lessons, right, to merit 3 webinars. And so now with the very last part of this intro to this webinar series, what I'm going to do is I'm going to preview for you what are these lessons learned from our DSP project planning and design on this pasture project. Okay, I'm going to preview those, and the balance of the presentation will be really unpacking those in some more detail. But we wanted to sum up, if you will, up front, the key lessons learned, and I'm going to try to do that briefly in the next slide. And before I go on, I should say, well, why are we doing this? Why are we unpacking these lessons learned? Well, one, to reinforce the lessons for ourselves, because we want to do more soil health assessment and we want it to be successful and meaningful. So we want to do it for ourselves. We want to share some of these lessons learned with others. So we're hoping that some of the things we've learned, particularly the mistakes we made, we're hoping there's someone out there today who will say, oh, okay, they made that mistake, so I don't have to make it again, right? I can learn from that. Hopefully it will help you. And perhaps even most importantly, we want to ask if we got it right. Like if our summary of what we learned makes sense to you, or maybe there are other lessons to be learned. Remember, again, we are focusing just on the planning and design. We feel like there's enough to unpack there. We're going to talk about implementation and logistics, and we're going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty of the lab and field assessments later. So let me summarize. I have one slide left, the 6 lessons learned, as I say it. Now, let me just also throw in this idea. Remember what a DSP project is about very briefly. The concept is we're going to find sites or soils that are inherently similar, but have been managed differently. And so this is a classic example, right? Fields across the road from each other. The soils have got to be made the same by our creator, by the factors of soil formation. And it's differences in management we're trying to tease out here. We're trying to figure out, well, how do those management differences over time result in changes in soil health, or a term that's used by our soil science division is dynamic soil properties. So how does management over time change dynamic soil properties? And the way we're trying to tease that out, finding these sites. Okay, so that's a little background. Well, what are these 6 lessons learned? Well, here they are. Okay, and a theme that you may note again and again is that, wow, Chris and friends, your lessons learned are really obvious. Like, why are they so simple? Don't you have anything more? Like, I already knew this. And that's, I think, in keeping with our desire in this project, the Soil Health Assessment Workgroup, is we feel like it's the simplest lessons and recommendations that most often get overlooked. And we overlooked some of our own advice when it came to project design. So clearly define the managements you want to compare, right? If you're going to compare managements, know what they are up front, and then know your sites and their management histories, right? Really dig in and understand how were these sites managed, so you can assign some meaning to the results when everything's done. The impact, the differences in soil, or the lack of differences in soil, was really due to some differences in management. Aim for more sites rather than less. Carefully select your assessments, obviously. And match your sampling protocol to your assessments. Boy, that sounds pretty obvious. And finally, watch out for some top 3 traps. And a way to get around those traps, the way it's written here, is you want to really focus on your project's purpose. You know, ask yourself continually, why am I doing this? What is the end goal? And let that inform your choices in your design. Avoid too many assessments on too few sites. There's just an incredible tendency to just throw as many tests as we can get our hands on at our sites, but perhaps that's a temptation we should be careful about giving into. And finally, budgeting enough time to do it right. So, you know, some of this stuff we did well, right? And so we learn, you might say, from our success in following these ideas. And you're going to see this slide again and again with these green checks. These are the lessons learned that you could say we learned through our success. But the lessons that are going to stick with us the most are the ones you could say we learned from our failure. We ultimately did not invest enough in knowing the sites where we did our sampling and their management histories. And that you could think of in some ways as a fatal flaw that is going to carry throughout the webinar series and throughout our discussion of our results. And it's going to undermine it's going to result in our measurement not being as meaningful as it could be. And another, you might say, fatal flaw we're going to talk about in detail is there was an agronomist who's speaking to currently me. I did not put enough effort into trying to make sure the sampling protocol made sense for the assessments we were running. And so these 2 fatal flaws, you might say, are, you know, not following these lessons, or I should say, these are examples of lessons we learned in a negative fashion, right? Failure to follow this advice. And so in our presentation today, Lydia is going to spend more time on lesson 2 and lesson 5 than any other. And I'd say the other lesson we feel like overall that we learned kind of from our mistakes is the importance of budgeting enough time to do it right. And that can probably apply to almost any project. So that's a preview. It's a summary up front of the lessons learned. And Lydia will get back into this after we, you know, have an overview, just checking in. Okay, what is DSP about? And what is this Pasture DSP project? And then ultimately, Lydia will go back into these 6 lessons learned and work on that. But are there any comments or questions at this point? We've covered these first 2 topics, and we're going to switch presenters as well. Any feedback? Okay, well, I'm going to hand it over to Lydia, hand the mic over to her.
Chris, we have a question from Mark Schombeck. Well, I put his hand down, so maybe he doesn't have it. Not sure.
Just very quickly, I think this is going to be very interesting because I've been always perplexed at the extreme variability in reported outcomes of a conversion to management intensive rotational grazing. You have people out there claiming this can just about save us from climate change because you fix a ton per acre of carbon every year in these pastures. And you get people saying, well, the grazing is worse than CAFOs and they're both worse than everybody going vegetarian. So it's a crock. And it's such an extreme variability. I'm just sitting here scratching my head, you know, how can this project that was obviously seemed to be well designed, but anyway, I'm just looking forward to seeing where some of these traps, particularly matching protocols, sampling protocols, might play into some of these wildly disparate results. Okay, thank you.
We also have another question for Alan.
Hey, thanks. Okay, Chris, maybe it would be useful to give a little bit of information. Why did who who started the project, DSP, and were there original guidelines to actually make the assessment?
Yeah, so for Alan, you have just set the stage or requested the next two sections of our presentation. That's where we're going next. And you will find out a little bit how we got to where we are and what protocols we followed and how we did not necessarily adapt them in a way that I wish we had. But certainly we're going to try to answer that question next. And just to go back to Mark's point, I don't know that this is going to show you all the answers, Mark, but I think what we're going to highlight is just how important it is to design your project properly from the start. And I can easily see, based on our experience, if you're trying to tease out differences in soil health, soil organic matter accumulation and so forth between different pasture systems, I could see how that you could have a wide range of relatively confusing outcomes.